This is not a document where I will talk mainly about books. So it should have been, this is not a book. The second thing is that although I now, after 15 years, can pretend that I am an historian when I talk to historians, when I talk about the work that I do in history and accounting, I cannot really pretend that I'm a historian when I talk about issues related to methodology on how to do history, or even epistemological issues like this one. So this is what it will be, and this is why I apologize, is basically a reflection on my historical work that I hope is interesting for the audience. So I've been looking at, in particular, the Society of Jesus and the administration of the Society of Jesus for quite some time. This happened by coincidence, and then I realized that, for instance, most of the accounting innovations that we still use nowadays were actually invented by some Jesuits, in particular by this guy here, Ludovico Flori, who published a book on how to keep the accounts of the Jesuit colleges in Palermo, my hometown, 1636. He was the inventor of the accruals. I guess that here there is only one accountant, maybe two, I don't know. But if you do not know what the accruals are the technical solutions through which you apportion income to two different years. Without that technical solution, you cannot really understand what the income of this year is and what the income of next year will be. And I started to look at the accounting of this Jesuits, so the stuff around the work of Ludovico Flori as an accounting historian, as a traditional accounting historian, which means that basically I was interested in understanding when was the first accrual being made, okay, or very technical things that were actually quite boring, I have to say. And so when I started to look at these things at the beginning as an accounting historian, then after a while I started to see that there were relationships with other things, accounting and modern method. Then later on I started to realize that there are relationships between accounting, rhetoric, and the art of memory. And more recently, this is what I'm doing at the moment, that accounting is basically a form of meditation and a religious practice. So while before, for instance, in one of the previous presentations, some of you were talking about, for instance, in the bank, there was some religion because they were Presbyterian. My point is actually that there is some religion because accounting is a religious practice. So not because you have religion there, but it's actually intrinsic in the way in which accounting as a practice has evolved. So what I want to do with you very quickly today, what time do you have to finish? At 2? Or?
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah. So I want to go very quickly through these four points. So accounting history, the first thing. So I started this work as a way of looking at the correspondence between theory and practice. There was this manual written in 1636, and I was naive at that time. I thought, okay, let's see whether the practice corresponds to the theory. And yeah, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And as I said, I didn't find that particularly interesting. You can describe things, but there was no, at the beginning of this research, any attempt to make what I call proper history, which is actually linking these things to many other things. Then I started to find these kinds of representations. This is in a book, in the other book that you saw, the cover that you saw in the first slide, by Benedictine, Angelo Pietra, 1586. And I started to reflect on a couple of things. The first one, this is very analytical, it should be related, or I'm sure that was the period in which modernity and modern method arose and became an important part of how knowledge was constructed. So I started to build relationships between accounting and Descartes, for instance, and analysis. And I realized that actually that was not historically, in a sense, possible, because Descartes is after this. But also I realized that there are other movements in those periods, late medieval and above all early modern times, which were much more powerful than discourses on method. In particular, Ramism and the way in which Peter Ramos at the University of Paris redefined the teaching of Aristotelian logic by organizing Aristotelian logic in these kinds of analytical representations to make sure that the students could learn Aristotelian logic in a much more simple way. That led me to the third part, where I then reinterpreted the very same accounting books, the very same accounting practice in another way that for me was illuminating. So, for instance, no one has ever reflected on the fact that if I ask you, do you know the etymology of the word inventory? Inventory is the first thing that we do in accounting. Do you know the etymology of the word inventory? Is there anyone who does classics here? Yeah. Latin? Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
It comes from inventio. What is inventio? Inventio is the first canon of rhetoric. Then I go back to that book by Ludovico Flori that every time I read it I find something different in it. Okay, and that book is organized in three parts. The first part, dell'inventario, about the inventory. Okay, fine, it's a book about accounting. The second part, though, was called dell'ordinazione e disposizione dei conti, of the ordination and disposition of the accounts. What is the second canon of classical rhetoric? Ordinatio and disposition. Then I look at the third part of the book, which is about the style that you have to choose when you communicate your results. What is the third canon of rhetoric? Elocutio, about the style of how you communicate your results. So I started to build these links between accounting, rhetoric, and art of memory. Why art of memory? Because accounting is intrinsically about recording things, and record comes from Latin, again, recorder, which means to remember. But to remember in a way, in a medieval way, which means also to construct new knowledge. And in fact, inventio originates two different things. One is inventory, the second thing is invention. So when you recombine the accounts, when you do the ordinatio and dispositio, you invent new knowledge. Now, the last part, which it's in between here and there, is about making these connections between how accounting has historically developed and how techniques of meditation or religious engagement of the believer were developed. In fact, if you go to some early modern churches, churches will be very much organized like books. Books were very much organized in rhetorical terms, and churches were organized like books because they had to be read by those who could not read. So you enter the church and you are made into a believer by experiencing the space, while nowadays we are made into believers by experiencing the book. So there are relationships there which are very, very strong, and I have a paper on this if you're interested. Now I'm getting now to another development of that aspect. So as much as there is a relationships between accounting, rhetoric, art of memory, and religion. And if you do not believe that this is an interesting point, you also have to reflect on one thing. All the early accounting books were all written by religious people, up to 1636, when then accounting became a lay practice. So what these people did was to use that background knowledge, mainly the trivium and the quadrivium, to organize books. And these practices were basically practices to devise wisdom. This is why the book by Franciscan in 1492 was called the divina proporzione, because it was about how to divide the income. It was about how to be just when you divide the income, how to be wise when you do these things. So the last part is about this wisdom. It's about how accounting developed this wisdom, and how accounting is a form of reflection rather than a form of representation. And how, for them at that time, accounting was exactly that. I mean, they did not use accounts to represent financial facts. They used accounts to reflect on who they were, what they wanted to do, where they were going, what kind of colors they had, what kind of mission they had. Of course, accounting still continues to work in that way, and of course, accounting still continues to make us believe that the information that it produces is true, while in fact all the accountants know that this is not the case. And the other issue is actually moving into other forms of reflection, like labyrinths and mazes, because an accounting system, if you're an accountant, is a labyrinth. There are tons of different accounts, and then you have to make choices of where to go and how to get to the final income statement. So this is where I am at the moment. I guess that the time is over, and so I don't know whether it made sense in 15 minutes to make a summary of 18 years of research, but here we are.
Thank you very much, and hopefully let's there. So we've got time for a couple of questions. Specific questions? Yeah.
I have a question. If you think that, for example, financial reports or annual reports are reflection rather than representation of the content, do you think they're useful?
Absolutely, they are much more useful if they are forms of reflection rather than forms of representation. I'm doing another work that I've cited yesterday as well. You were in the lecture, right? On the accounting system of Erie, which was the largest Italian state-owned enterprise, and this is exactly what they did. Given the dimension of that enterprise, which accounted for several points of Italian GDP, when they were doing planning, they were not trying to represent the future. They were making choices about what kind of society do we want. So do I want to distribute the value added that I produce to shareholders, or to workers, to banks, to whom? So it was a process of reflecting on what kind of economic policy, but also social policy you were implementing. Nothing to do with representation. Accounting becomes. I have another presentation on this. Unfortunately, yesterday we didn't have time to show these 4 slides, where I say that from the Jesuits until 1980, I'm not saying 1880, 1780, no, until 1980, in Italy, accounting has always been about the impossibility of representation, even technically. The way in which you organize the accounts were made in a way that you should be suspicious about the bottom line. So exactly because accountants know, either for technical skills or for moral skills, like in the case of the Jesuits, that a representation is impossible. It's actually even dangerous.
Miguel, last question.
Yeah, well, in your presentation, you can see very clearly that accountancy, as it was practiced in the Jesuit times, is very different from nowadays. And there has also been, I think, been a shift from being a practice of the humanities, of the human sciences,
in that sense, yes,
to be much more framed in as a technical form of knowledge in mathematics, etc. I wanted to know whether the way account is practiced now and the differences with how it was practiced before reflects also a power shift between the humanities and the more natural, exact, technical sciences. And maybe, I mean, we were discussing about whether looking at documents in the past we can make connections with the contemporary. If that is the case, whether there is room for making a case about maybe recovering this humanistic way of accountancy.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel, for this. Oh, by the way, before I forget, why did I organize the presentation this way? Because the idea is that a document is a texture. And so if you link this to certain books or to certain things, you can say different things. If I read the art of memory, I can say certain things that if I read economics, I cannot say. I would say other things, but that, no, I didn't say that, but it was probably clear. Then what you're saying is absolutely true. There is a very nice book that I always cite by Liz Jardine and Tony Grafton, who the book is titled From Humanism to the Humanities. And this is exactly what happens with accounting. Accounting was a humanist practice. When humanism becomes humanities, accounting becomes lay, a lay practice, something which is no longer linked to the improvement of morals, and it becomes basically a skill, and therefore if you manage that skill well, you are just. So that there is an isomorphism between the practicing of the practice, and so the skillfulness of the user, and the justness of that user. While before, these two they were two different things. And so now this is why utility is just. It's a moral thing. Because we are still within the framework that makes us construct certain notional morals, but because we don't have that other background, the humanist background, we construct that notional moral just because just because of the use of that technique, which is economic, and therefore we have utility as a form of justice, which in fact was not the case before. So thanks a lot for that.
Awesome.
I think it's an important point.
More questions later. Let's move on to Lisa. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.